What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through competitive play for the last weekend and talk about undefeated lists. Now, we are going to have a little bit of a short episode this week, not because we didn't have events to talk about, but because we have seen a little bit of a consolidation of the 40k metagame. Looking at the metagame breakdown, we can see that Necrons have taken the vast majority of undefeated spots, taking down the All-Stars warm-up Clash of the Titans GT, as well as getting the top 2 placings in one of the weekend's majors, the Fantasia Fnatic, alongside Elb Coast Cup and Nemesis Spring. Adepta Sororitas also saw some success this week, taking down the Oxford Super Major, a Super Major level event, hence the name. We'll be talking about that list this week, as well as winning the Pantheon Invades ShireCon. Tau Empire also did fairly well, taking down the Wardrome GT and the Tau Tipping event, appropriately. We won't be talking about Tau Empire this week, however, as we are staring down the barrel of their newest codex, which is now available for pre-order and will be releasing soon. The same is going to go for Orcs, since we do have previews of the new Orc codex, so lists that we talk about now are going to be invalid post-haste. Astra Militarum also doing fairly well, and actually at the Oxford Super Major doing extremely well, having 2 of the top 4 post-cut lists. They also won the Nidaros Grand Tournament as well as the Grand Clash, having an extremely strong weekend. Leagues of Votann was also undefeated at the Fantasia Fnatic. That event went only long enough to have 3 undefeated players with 5 wins on their record. So there were 2 Necron players there and 1 Leagues of Votann that we'll be talking about. Thousand Suns actually taking down 2 GTs this weekend, the GT of Contempt and the Southwest Smoker, with an insane list that I'm excited to talk about. Orcs last, but certainly not least, with the Team Hobby Chest Open. So let's dive into these lists and start with our big winner for the weekend, Necrons. At the Fantasia Fnatic, Jesper Unundersharin went undefeated with the faction taking a Hypercrypt Legion detachment, running an extremely heavy ranged focus variety. This list was built around several Catan shards, a Catan shard of the Nightbringer alongside 2 Transcendent Catan. The Transcendent Catan having Deep Strike on their datasheet makes them extremely powerful within this detachment, and while it can speed up the Catan shard of the Nightbringer, it does allow those units to Deep Strike on the first turn. Imhotep the Stormlord is also included in the list to make their Deep Strikes a little bit better by providing CP you can use on stratagems like Cosmic Precision. We then also have a Technomancer with Arisen Tyrant to grant his unit rerolls when they arrive out of reserve. That is useful because he is diving into a unit of 6 Canoptic Wraiths. Those guys are taking Particle Casters, and Wraiths with their mediocre weapon skill are going to get a big benefit from this ability. That will also affect their melee attacks as well for that round, since it affects all their attacks. And that's a big benefit to the list because they can actually be delivered into melee by the Monolith. That's also inside the build. We then had a lot of ranged attacks, 3 Locust Destroyers, those guys mostly for teleporting around and doing some actions, alongside 3 Locust Heavy Destroyers in 1 unit and a Doomsday Arc. That Monolith is the interesting inclusion here, and while normally it would appear like it doesn't actually have any units to use alongside it, its Eternity Gate besides Imhotep himself, I believe that the interaction in this list is that because the Technomancer is attaching to the Canoptic Wraiths unit, they are both a beast and infantry unit, meaning that they can be affected by the Monolith's Eternity Gate. That allows them to pick up off the table in your reinforcement step and set up outside engagement range of enemy units, wholly within 6 inches of the Monolith. Because they're then set up on the battlefield, a Risen Tyrant will trigger, and you can use the Dimensional Corridor stratagem to charge them out of the Monolith and get rerolls on both their Particle Casters and their melee attacks. That gives an enormous buff to the otherwise mediocre offensive stats of the Canoptic Wraiths and is an interesting use of the Monolith combo within the list. Being OC2 based, Canoptic Wraiths are also fairly good at stealing objectives away from enemies, which is the normal use case of that Eternity Gate movement. Now, Dimensional Corridor does cost you 2 CP, so it is an expensive proposition, but again, we do have Imhotep the Stormlord in the list to shore up its CP expenditure over the course of the game. So it's not breaking the bank, but it is going to be a spicy spend. Super interesting list from Jesper this time around, and it's cool to see even more innovation within the Necron faction, which I'm sure is leading them to their massive undefeated results that we see them bringing this week. Now with that, let's move on to discuss Vic Vijay's list from the Oxford Super Major. Vic taking Adepta Sororitas, being led by Saint Celestine, as well as a Canoness with the Blade of Saint Eleanor and the Triumph of Saint Catherine. Canoness running the Blessed Blade, with that blade to make her a little bit more offensively oriented. However, we don't see the Palatine that we typically see with that upgrade. We also don't see Morven Val in the list, but we're going to be focusing fairly heavily on Sororitas armor elsewhere in the list because it's taking 3 Castigators as well as 3 additional transports, 1 Immolator and 2 Sororitas Rhinos. The Immolator can split the Battle Sister squad that's in the list into 2, creating 2 combat squads from that single unit of 10. One of them could be joined by the Canoness to give it rerolls to increase the effectiveness of its Melta attacks. You can then give it full hit and wound rerolls thanks to the Canoness's attachment and the Immolator's fire support when they disembark, making those Melta and multi-Melta shots from that 5 Model Sister squad very effective. The Arco-Flagellants in the list, of which there are 3 units of 10, are going to be able to be carried into battle by the Rhinos. That's all backed up by the Castigator's long-range shooting, and we have a ton of Zephyrim and Seraphim units to act as scoring assistants, alongside 2 units of Crusaders. We have 1 unit of 5 Zephyrim and 3 units of 5 Seraphim, alongside a 10 model unit of Zephyrim that is likely attaching in St. Celestine to increase the resilience of that big unit. You can then deep strike them into an annoying place in your opponent's backline, auto pass charges, or at least give you a much better chance of succeeding charges with Miracle Dice, getting them into melee, stealing objectives, tying up enemy long-range guns, and using the Sisters' superlative ability to score and gain lots of Miracle Dice, alongside reanimating their characters to farm insane numbers of points. That clearly worked out for Vic because he went undefeated out of a staggering 251 players after 7 rounds of 40k, being the only undefeated player at the end of that event. Although, it should be noted that 2 Astra Militarum players and a Tau Empire player successfully made the top cut at the event, and there were several undefeated players who did not make the top cut, 3 with X0-1 records, including some Tyranids that I'm sure we'll talk about on my Tuesday stream later on this week, alongside Leagues of Votann and Adeptus Custodes. Now, speaking of those other undefeated lists, Astra Militarum, let's move on to talk about John Russell's list. This one from the Grand Clash 2024. John was running an interesting and fairly aggressive variety of Astra Militarum. This was being led by Lord Solar Leontis himself. It's also bringing a platoon command squad for him to join into, 1 tank commander and Ursula Creed, as you've seen in most Astra Militarum lists. That obviously gives Lord Solar Leontis the ability to join into a command squad, make use of their Master Vox, and have Ursula Creed nearby to empower their mortar with a free use of overlapping fields of fire to give anything in your army plus 1 AP if you need it. We also then had a Death Corps Marshal alongside Gon's Ghosts as a utility unit, and a Militarum Command Squad. The Militarum Command Squad is actually jumping into a big 10 model unit of Tempestus Scions. These guys are a very effective anti-infantry shooting unit. They're able to bring 2 melta guns, 2 plasma guns, as well as a bunch of hotshot las guns. Get an order from the command squad itself, even when they deep strike onto the table, thanks to the last update to the order mechanics, and their Tempestor Prime is also giving the unit sustained 1. Because they get rerolls to hit against units on objectives, that gives them a great chance to trigger that sustained 1. They also have an additional melta gun and plasma gun from the heavy weapon troopers inside the command squad itself, making this full unit of 15 models, 3 melta guns, 3 plasma guns, being affected by orders and getting sustained, alongside rerolls attacking an enemy unit on an objective. That is a lot of firepower. We then had another unit of 5 Tempestus Scions to act as a utility unit, and a ton of infantry. 1 Death Corps of Krieg unit, which is probably going to be acting as the command bunker to attach in the platoon command squad and Lord Solar Leontis, alongside a 20 model Death Corps of Krieg unit to benefit from the attached Death Corps Marshal. These guys can act as an enormous bulwark in the center of the table. They are difficult to kill, have a feel no pain, as well as regenerate models back into the unit, and being affected by orders also makes them fairly reasonable with 2 melta guns and 2 plasma guns in that brick as well. They're also not too expensive and extremely good at out objective controlling basically anything in the game. 20 OC2 models with the ability to go to OC3 with an applied order makes them incredibly good at stealing objectives or holding table space, which is a problem that Astra Militarum often have. We then have 10 Adalid Rough Riders that can follow up behind those guardsmen and clear out any enemies trying to impede their progress. The Adalid Rough Riders are an incredibly powerful melee unit. They are long threat range, especially when being affected by move, and they are also a regiment unit, so they can be respawned for 2 CP once destroyed, allowing you to bring them in out of strategic reserve and potentially get another devastating charge out of their lances. We had 2 units of Kazarkin to act as forward operators, 2 Scout Sentinels to buff the artillery in the back, and speaking of the artillery, we had 1 Basilisk and 2 Manticores to add some fire support, alongside a tank commander to give a little bit of direct fire to the list. A little bit of a combination of some newfound technology, or maybe rediscovered technology with those Death Corps of Krieg, alongside some classic Astra Militarum infantry that we've seen since the outset of the edition. And with that, let us return to the Fantasia Fanatic, where Rasmus Haglund went undefeated with Leagues of Votann. Now, Rasmus was third place at the event, but went 5-0, tying in wins at least with the other Necron players that went undefeated. Rasmus was running 2 Einhir champions alongside a Grimnir and Khal in his list. The mainstay of the list was 3 Hecaton land fortresses. We also had 2 units of Einhir Hearthguard that could be attached into those land fortresses potentially. 1 unit of 6 Hernkin Pioneers to add some forward operation. A single Sagittor, which could embark either the Grimnir or a combat squad of Hearthkin warriors, and add a little bit of additional scout into the army, alongside a unit of 10 Einhir Hearthguard, which was either going to ground pound or teleport onto the table. It's been a little while since we've seen the Hecaton Land Fortress variety of Leagues of Votann do well. Typically, we've been seeing mass Hernkin Pioneers or mass Sagittors be most effective, but those land fortresses add an enormously resilient, high damage output core to the army. They were equipped with SP heavy conversion beamers, so they wanted to stay fairly far away from their targets to get the benefit of those conversion beams. They're able to score lots of additional hits with their sustained effect. Then, if anything gets close, to try to close the distance with those conversion beamers, they can then disembark their more powerful short-range shooting or melee units to clear out any offending enemies. And they're tough enough to kill. You can move forward fairly aggressively without really having to worry about your opponent knocking you out of the center of the table too quickly. And with that, we will talk about the last list that we have, and this one is a little bit of a doozy. This is from the Southwest Smoker event, John Camacho going undefeated with Thousand Suns. This list is absolutely insane. It's bringing a lot of technology that we haven't seen, I think, ever. And let me tell you, if I'm not entirely sure what direction this list is going, that's because it is a wild thing. It's a crazy list. We're running Araman on a Disc of Tzeentch alongside Magnus the Red and a Thousand Suns Demon Prince with Wing. It's the Winged Demon Prince, not the Foot Demon Prince, which provides stealth in an aura. We see the Foot Demon Prince fairly often to add another defensive layer on top of Thousand Suns monsters like Megalith Vortex Beasts or Magnus the Red himself, which can make them hard to kill for some offensive profiles. But the Winged Demon Prince actually comes with some more esoteric and utility abilities. It can deal mortal wounds to enemies it moves over, although with only an 11-inch movement, that is a little tough. You roll 9d6 if it moves over an enemy. For each 6 you roll, the unit suffers 1 mortal wound, so it's probably doing somewhere around 1 to 2 on average. However, it also has an uppy downy effect. At the end of your opponent's turn, if it's not in engagement range, you can put it into reinforcements and deep strike it then again next turn. It doesn't deep strike naturally, you have to use its uppy downy ability, but Thousand Suns tend to be fairly good with abilities like this because they can set it up and then use Temporal Surge to double move it after it's set up. Its Sorcerer's Fire ability triggers every time it completes a normal move, so every time it moves thanks to Temporal Surge, it will also deal its mortal wounds again. So, using Lord of Forbidden Lore on one of these Zangor Shamans in the list to duplicate that Temporal Surge, we can potentially be doing several sets of automatic mortal wounds to an enemy unit that the Demon Prince is moving over. He is also bringing Arcane Vortex to increase the strength and damage of his psychic weapons, which unfortunately doesn't include his ranged attack for whatever reason, but does affect his melee attack, pushing him to strength 9 and 4 damage. As long as he's remaining within range of Magnus, he's getting +1 to hit and wound with that weapon profile, which actually makes him a fairly reasonable threat to a lot of heavily armored enemies. And because it's a psychic weapon, it's most likely getting devastating wounds from their detachment ability. That said, it is not a ranged attack, so it is important to note that it can't be used alongside the devastating sorcery stratagem. I see several people try to use that in melee weapons. You can't do that. That only works in your shooting phase. So there aren't many ways to get the rerolls on this guy in melee, but that +1 to wound from Magnus certainly helps if he's in range. From there, like I mentioned before, we do have a Zangor Shaman. In fact, we have 2 in this list. These guys are just cheap little mounted units that are psychers, so they can use the Kabbalistic rituals that Thousand Suns bring to the table. One of the Zangor Shamans bringing Lord of Forbidden Lore to duplicate already used rituals, alongside the other one bringing the Athenaean Scrolls. We have a unit of 10 Rubric Marines for Ahriman to join into, those guys equipped all with Warp Flamers, alongside 2 units of 10 Zangors. Now the Zangors, I don't know if these Zangor Shamans are attaching into them or, wait for it, the 2 units of 6 Zangor Enlightened, we also have in the list. Either one would kind of make sense. The Zangors are a little bit of a hardier melee threat and aggressive high OC units, which could benefit from the +1 to hit that the Zangor Shamans have. The Zangor Enlightened, on the other hand, are a little bit more standoffish and also benefit from the +1 to hit that the Zangor Shamans grant them because they have some fairly reasonable ranged attacks. They themselves are fairly annoying, and while they are mounted, so they can't go through walls, so their mobility is a little bit suspect, you can use Temporal Surge to try to get around that, and they have a reactive move. So if enemies move closer to them, they can run away and make charges and holding objectives pretty tough. We also had 3 units of Chaos Spawn. Those can go through walls and are an excellent utility unit for the faction, alongside 2 Mutalith Vortex Beasts. These guys bringing some heavy hitting attacks both in melee and at range, alongside an incredibly resilient defensive profile. This list is absolutely wild. It is highly technical, has many utility-focused objective scoring units alongside some bizarre combos within the character boat. I'm sure there are a lot of micro synergies within the list and small ways that John has constructed it to play to his playstyle. So without seeing it played on the table, it's a little difficult to entirely gauge how effective it is, but clearly good enough to 5-0 this GT because John obviously took down the event. And with that, as I mentioned before, the armies that are using outdated codexes we won't be talking about this week, so that will close us out for the weekend of April 20th and 21st, 2024. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video, everyone. Let me know down in the comments section which list this week is your favorite, and big thanks to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.